Hello, everybody. I think we're ready to start. My name is Peter Maravellis. I'm the events director here at City Lights, welcoming you to another evening of collaboration with our friends at Litquake. Litquake has a new director, Nora Pyle, and we are thrilled to be able to work with her this year. She's doing some amazing programming. There is a catalog at the front counter. Please check it out. We're at the not quite over the hump yet. A lot of events coming up. To talk a little bit about that now, we have Jody Weiner, who is the head of the board of the Litquake Foundation, to talk a little bit about that.
And actually, welcome to the 25th anniversary of Litquake. We are San Francisco's literary festival, and not as long as City Lights, but we've been here a while now. We're a little mighty engine that could. I'm Jody Weiner, board president, and this year we're actually presenting 140 events over the course of the 2.5 weeks of the Litquake Festival, which is going to culminate on Saturday with the infamous Lit Crawl, where we have 60 events over the course of 4 hours during the mission. So it's all free, and there are going to be 500 authors that are being featured during this year's festival. So come on out and see it. Tonight, we are really honored to co-host the celebration of Cellophane Bricks, a life in visual culture, with actually 2 superstar authors. Of course, Jonathan Lethem, the author of the book, and Rita Bullwinkle. But a special thanks to City Lights, booksellers, and publishers for helping make this event possible. And a few notes of business before you guys get started. We are a small nonprofit, and tonight's event is free. And as you know, and we primarily exist on your donations to support the organization. We're really proud of the fact that nearly 90% of our events each year are free. And all the money we raise goes to produce these events and also to present our KidQuake, where we support children's literature and hand out books and help kids who are in underserving neighborhoods, and also our Elder Project, which serves elders. And we actually, at the end of a year, we go into some of the senior centers and we encourage them to write memoirs, which we publish at the end of each one of those sessions. So it's a really good thing that you're doing. And the ticket sales only cover a tiny portion of our producing the festival. So please consider dropping a few dollars on your way out. I mean, you never know, you might feel good about doing something for others and for yourself. So we accept donations on Venmo, at PayPal, or directly at litquake.org. And just to make it easier, if you take a look at the calendar, the schedule of events, because there are still more events, there are a bunch of programs at the up in front. If you go to page 31, it makes it easier to donate there. Also tonight, Jonathan's books are on sale tonight. Rita's books sold out, so there are no more, which is actually great, but tonight. But if you stick around, Jonathan will sign them for you. And but now, last but not least, I want to introduce Maestro Peter Maravellis, who will get us started. So thank you all and enjoy.
Thank you, Jody. So, of course, a new Jonathan Lethem book is always an event in and of itself. He needs little introduction. You know, he's a master wordsmith. He's written such books as Motherless Brooklyn, The Fortress of Solitude, but there's something about Cellophane Brick. I'm in love with this book. And I told Jonathan's story earlier. Years ago, we had Douglas Coupland read here at City Lights, and it was okay. It was an okay reading. There were people here and he signed the books. But at the very end is when it really all came together. Rex Ray, who was a designer here at City Lights, who had designed a lot of our book covers, got into a conversation with him about the arts. And at one point, Douglas turns around. He has this huge bag, canvas bag filled with stuff, really heavy. He starts pulling out colored tile. And he fills out the entire floor of this main room with colored tile as they're talking about the arts. And there was something about just the intersection of literature and the arts. And when I saw this book and when I beheld this book, I realized just what an exquisite artifact it is. And so it's such a wonderful, wonderful thing. I hope you will get a chance to pick it up. And to have Rita Bullwinkle, author of Headshot, here with us in conversation. That's just kind of the icing on the cake. What more can you ask for? Joyful, joyful thing. Welcome to you both. Such a huge pleasure.
Thank you, Peter.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for turning up, filling this room. Should I just jump in?
Jump right in.
Okay. So Rita suggested, and I thought it was a great suggestion, that I would read a little bit first. And she even had a piece in mind. And I love when people pick out what I should read, because I always end up reading a part of a book that I haven't read aloud before. It might not have even occurred to me to try this one. And so this will probably be 8 or 10-minute reading. And it's all of one of the pieces in this book, which is a book of writings about artworks, almost all of them pegged on very individual objects. And this is no exception, and I'll flash it. It's not very easy to see from a distance, but the piece that I'm writing about here is a drawing by the Canadian graphic novelist Chester Brown, who which was made on commission from me directly as the jacket art for a short book, a small book, a novella I published with McSweeney's. And it was the 3rd ever McSweeney's book in 1999. And I was very directly involved in the designing of the book and the idea that Chester Brown should draw the picture. And I was actually living in Toronto at the time. So, well, you'll hear all of that in the piece.
It's such a fantastic quest. I'm so grateful you're going to read it.
Thank you. Here, yeah, so it's called A Furtive Exchange. Oh, and what you need to know is that the book that Chester Brown had just published before, I mean, he's done a lot of them by now, but there was a famous and somewhat scandalous graphic novel called Paying for It, which was an autobiographical, I want to call it a confessional book, but it wasn't really confessional in the sense that he was guilty of anything, or he felt guilty about anything, but it was about his life as a paying customer of sex workers. And so I was writing this at a time when that was his famous book. So this is called A Furtive Exchange, Chester Brown. Reading Chester Brown's Paying for It, I found myself unexpectedly recalling a trepidatious and exciting visit I once made in 2000 to an anonymous-looking apartment in downtown Toronto. I went there looking to make a transaction, one in which I would exchange money for something I regard as beyond price, something from a realm outside that of transactions and money. But wait, before you leap to any conclusions, let me slow down and explain. Actually, before I explain, let me mention that I regard Paying for It as simply, or not so simply, the most recent in a series of totally characteristic and totally unpredictable masterpieces by one of our greatest ever cartoonists or comic book artists or graphic novelists or whatever we're calling them. Notice also how I avoided having to say North American by saying our, which I prefer because Louise Riel aside, and that's a big aside, Chester Brown seems to me both more iconoclastic and more universal than Canadian or North American. He's a citizen of the timeless nation of the dissident soul, as much as Dostoevsky's underground man. At the same time, he's also a citizen of a nation of one, Chester Brownton, or Chester Brownsylvania, a desolate but charged region he seems to have no choice but to inhabit, and of which I feel quite privileged to be a regular visitor. So, what was I seeking at the anonymous-looking apartment in downtown Toronto in the year 2000? I was seeking to commission Chester Brown to draw a cover for a book I'd written, a novella, and that I was designing myself. As it happens, I'd persuaded my publisher collaborator that Brown was the ideal artist for the project, not difficult to do. And since also, as it happens, I was intermittently living in Toronto at the time, I made it a fair excuse to impress myself on the man. He was already then my favorite. I wanted to describe the project to him in person and propose a very particular 2-part deal to him as well. I wanted him to draw the cover image for the book, and I also wanted to own a Chester Brown original. And so I asked if I could arrange to purchase the drawing for the cover in advance. What happened? Brown welcomed me in and listened to my wishes in a kind of attentively distant way, a kind of deadpan but not unfriendly way, one that was, of course, already somewhat familiar to me from his autobiographical comics and has subsequently become vastly more familiar. And then he agreed. Brown got the gist of what I wanted, and it was okay. He wasn't judgmental of my odd wishes. He could help me with this, yes. Though this wasn't without its humorous aspects. The fiction I'd written that needed the illustration, nor the situation of my describing it to him. The novella concerned a slumbering army of soldiers living inside a gigantic body. And so the drawing I requested for the cover was of a commander and his lieutenant marching, lost, within an enormous human intestinal tract. The dialogue between us was oddly furtive and clinical, somewhat clipped and efficient, though, as I said, not in any way unfriendly. The gist of it seemed to be that Brown was able to relieve me of my problem. I think he charged me $800 or $300 or $500. I can't remember. Now, since I've never paid for sex, an assertion which, due to Brown's insinuating rhetorical powers in the footnote sections of Paying for It, and because of the brilliantly pervasive aura of shame that infuses so much of Brown's work, I can practically verge on experiencing as an embarrassing confession. Shouldn't I have done so at some point? But no, that's not right. I'm over-identifying with my subject right now. What this felt like to me was a visit to a drug dealer. I'd found the right address and been welcomed inside and told, sure, I can hook you up. And I'm not going to make you feel like a sick fuck for wanting what you want. Some persons just need a drawing of army men lost inside an intestine from time to time. You've come to the right place. And I had. Though I ordinarily hate illustrational approaches to my writing and have fought like a cornered terrier repeatedly to get art directors from major publishers to revert to jacket designs that consist purely of metaphorical or abstract imagery or of font, there's something about Brown's line that works for me entirely as a representation of what written language does. His lines, his compositions and forms are both persuasively somatic, grotty, physical, homely, a testimony or confession of the body, and simultaneously a thing of the deep soul ether. They fuse the actual and the metaphysical as their baseline operation. No matter how hard Brown may work to purge this spiritual, phantasmagorical element from his drawing and to ground us instead in a flensed and prosaic world, it is felt under the skin. Of course, in describing this tension between the physical and the metaphysical, I have the benefit of study of his progression, of the progression of his works, from Ed the Happy Clown to the Gospels to the awesomely hypnotic and reader-resistant Underwater. That's a triad of monumental unfinished works. And how unusual is it that for Brown, he began his career with the habit of abandoning gigantic, unwieldy canvases and then switched to the increasing focus on actuality in some of the great short works like Helder and Showing Helder, and then, of course, in I Never Liked You and Louis Riel and The Playboy, a triad of finished works. And how odd for the serial abandoner of potential masterworks to become a consummate completer of them. This progression helps us appreciate the quality of focus and restriction, the sublimely microscopic attentiveness of the style that subsequently evolved. But the early works also cue us to the atmosphere of the surreal and grotesque and the transcendent, those things which steadily hum just beneath the surface of Brown's contained panels, inside his silent passages and the dampened body language and facial expressions and blocking of his human features, all of which are quivering in their containment with their potential to erupt. So what was it like to meet Chester Brown and to make that furtive exchange of cash for sublimity? What was it really like? I'm tempted to joke that the little man was not little, or that the happy clown did not seem particularly happy, but neither did he begin screaming and weeping and snapping his stick-like limbs. But then it is the case that you know those things, because in the tradition of R. Crumb and Daniel Close and Michel de Montaigne, Chester Brown has delivered himself to us, made himself knowable despite the seeming impossibility of the human desire to be knowable, and Brown's obvious ambivalence at even trying to do so. But what I want to say is this: though I've met many of my heroes, and many of them writers, and many of them writers of great privacy and intensity, and of powerful properties of both empathy and alienation, I think I'll never come as near as I did that day in Toronto in 2000 to being able to imagine what it would have been like to pay a call on Franz Kafka. Thanks. So glad you asked me to read that one. It really would not have occurred to me as a piece to reel out. And then there's that big comedy bit in the middle.
Oh my gosh, I love it so much. This book is so expansive and exists in so many different modes. There is this section of you writing stories in response to artworks or in conversation with artworks. I'm so curious to know how you think about their relationship. And then, of course, there's this section of like what art has adorned books you've written, which is what we just heard from. And then this amazing section of the art you live with, the art in your home, and woven throughout, of course, your own past as a painter, the influence that your father has had on you as still an active painter. So there's like this element of biography as well. There's so much in there. I feel like I know other literary books about authors' relationships with art, but it's usually a very narrow, specific relationship, whereas this feels so wide. How did this book come to coalesce?
Well, I mean, so you offered me the easy way to answer this because you've already kind of enumerated the menu, and it really begins with my dad, with growing up in a house where someone was painting. So that, in the way that anything that you first meet as a, pre-linguistic crawling, animal, is just, it's in your body. It's a basic thing. It's like, there's the parent, there's the food, and there's this room where the paint is being put on canvases. And I don't remember the beginning of that, that experience. I just know it's rooted in me so deeply. And of course, it produced a really obvious first result, which was I wanted to do it. And I did do it. I made drawings and sort of paintings before I can remember. And I kept doing it, and I became like a little art prodigy kid and went to a special high school for the arts. And I worked in my father's studio. And I was also blessed just that it wasn't in a way only him. It was that was his world, and his friends and his students would be around. And I used to go with him even to life drawing classes that were, they weren't classes. They were just actually drawing groups of artists, him and his friends who'd hire a model. And so this was like a part of life for me that was very familiar, but that didn't mean it wasn't also romantic and exotic and exciting. It just was close to me. And I was also blessed in living in New York City. And so you could fall out of your house and be in galleries and museums and
You talk about napping at the Met.
yeah,
as a high
in high school,
schooler.
I used to have a room in the Met that I knew I could catch some Z's in. The Chinese Garden. There was even like a particular rock in the rock part where I could put my head and they wouldn't wake you up. And I used to go to the Frick in high school a lot too, and get high in Prospect in Central Park, and then go to the Frick and stare at this one sleeve that Holbein the Elder had painted, that was psychedelic.
Amazing.
But also, I was hanging out in a space where art was being made and looked at and talked about, because his paintings were in progress, and he would say, well, what do you think is happening here? And we, so it was like the idea of the process was really alive for me. In a way, this book records how I navigated that original intensity, and also in a way records the trauma of my abandonment of the practice, because I loved making art, and it's strongly related to what I ended up spending my life devoted to. But then again, it represents a breach. I left something behind. And so wanting to hang out with artists, I sort of became a vicarious artist. I wanted to be in studios. I wanted to have their art on my walls. I wanted to continue to think about paintings and sculptures, even though I wasn't making them anymore.
Another favorite section of mine, okay, which I will also confess that something really amazing about the structure of this book is that even though it's separated out into these groupings, in my memory of the book after I've read it, I find that the borders between the sections are very permeable. And in my memory, I often can't remember which section they're from, which I love.
They really all talk to each other.
So I can't remember which section.
I can't either.
This anecdote, it's not an anecdote, it's a beautifully felt piece of prose is from, but it's where it's maybe like 3 or 4 pages, and it's this lyric image of you as a pre-toddler being held back from entering your father's studio as your mother. One of your earliest memory.
My very earliest memory was of me trying to get into his studio.
And this piece is this drawn out half of a second, expanded out to where you can feel your toddler body being pulled back by your mother. It's so incredible. Yeah, it's amazing. Is that in the ecstasy section?
I think it's right towards the end, actually, when I'm writing about his work and my relation to it. Yeah. So the book is circular. I mean, this leads to talking about just the circumstances, right? This is a collection of mostly pieces written in individual occasions over like 3 decades, when artists would ask me to write about their work, and I would have to say to them, well, I can't really do it in art writing because I don't know how to do art writing per se, like the kind of thing that.
Even though you've written a giant book of art writing.
Well, no, I have this book now, but my first answer had to be, I don't know how to do art critical writing. And that was, not that I was, by then I was beginning to be an essayist, and I have written lots of criticism or nonfiction about cultural stuff, about films and music. I wrote a whole short book about one film once and one album once, and I've written plenty of book reviews, which lots of novelists get asked to do all the time. But I found myself really faltering when artists wanted, they didn't really want, but when they'd ask me initially, I think they wanted art writing like we know it from the magazines or from catalogs or gallery materials, and I realized I didn't have a personal model for that. I didn't read it avidly. Whereas there were film critics, music writers, especially music writers, that taught me how to read and think and write, and that I was permanently engaged with as much as I was with literary sources like novels or poems or stories. I didn't have that relation to art writing. And I can think of, I have postulates about that, but I don't need to get into why that seems so different to me. But because the more interesting thing is to talk about what I did instead. I would say, well, I kind of want to write something for you, but I'm sure it can't be like, like what you read in, art forum or whatever, or a catalog essay. But maybe I could write you a story. Maybe I could write you something like I write, but about your work. And I started experimenting with this. And first of all, the artists were always interested in that and invited me to try. And then I got to where it was a thing. And I started doing it, and seeking out opportunities because I realized I really liked it. It wasn't really exactly fiction. They're sort of fictional essays, but they're also like mind melds. It's sort of like a mirror game where I pretend to be that artist and I write a story about what the world looks like to them.
Specifically with the stories, I was so curious, do you think of them as being in conversation or in response to the physical pieces? And then part 2 of that question, as I reading the stories, I was so curious if there was when those pieces were first written, if any of them were presented in a way either in the gallery or in a monograph that you were really excited about.
Yeah, well, so the venue changed a lot at different times. I think the first time I ever did this was for an artist friend named Perry Hoberman, who I'm still friends with, although he doesn't really make art that's shown in galleries anymore. He's in he lives in the high desert. I see him in Joshua Tree and 29 Palms, and he's in like a band, and he makes these pop-up Joshua trees that you can look at with 3D glasses. He's sort of has a big past as a gallery artist, but he's a tinkerer and an inventor. He makes strange things. And so I wrote for Perry, and I think that was for a catalog of writings to accompany an exhibition in Finland. So it wasn't even to be published in English. It got translated immediately into Finnish. And that weird example is the beginning of my writing directly about people's art for venues. And it was for a catalog, but not in English. And then sometimes it was for, just an eccentric handout or something, or some ephemeral material that would be like maybe on a free sheet that would be in a gallery. Other times, like when I wrote for the photographer Gregory Crewdson, it was to be the central text in this massive coffee table retrospective of his entire life's work published by Rizzoli. So it was like the opposite. It was this, super canonical thing for the artist, but I still went ahead and wrote in this insane, speculative, fictional way. I didn't write about why his photographs are important or anything like that. What was a prerequisite, whatever the venue was going to be, was that I had to have a really strong relationship with the work and the artist. And so sometimes it was with an individual object. I mean, in this case with Crewdson, it was not just one show's worth of his work or one phase of his work, but I studied and immersed myself in all these different, because it was going to be a retrospective, all these different modes he'd worked in, and I tried to write a piece that moved from one to the next. Obviously, it was a bigger job, but I still approached it in the same oblique fashion.
Yeah, all of the words that I feel like we have to describe this process that you are doing feel inadequate because the conversation doesn't really seem to fit, and response seems not to reflect the permeableness of what's going on. Have you landed on any better language?
One thing that I like to say about this book is that it records it records social practice.
Right.
It's about experiences with people in their studios. And so I'm really writing about myself and this artist and I'm writing about the projective space that happens when you are looking at someone's work, but also thinking a lot about how they decided to make it and who they had to be in order to make it. And so it's really about it's a very personal book. It's kind of like phantom memoir writing, because I'm even though I'm pretending always to be writing about something outside of me, I have to constantly use a kind of double mirror and use what I know about how to look at the world and things that I'm guessing about how they feel and operate. So it's really a very intimate book that way.
It is an incredibly intimate book. One of the intimacies of it that I really loved is the home section, the idea that you gift us images and reflections on the art that you live with in your home, which is a very it's such an enchanting thing. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why I really love the Frick, is because it was a home.
Yeah.
And I do really love house museums typically. And there are so many writers who I think have such astute visual eyes, and the objects and images that they choose to live with have some extra potency or are captivating. And the only piece of writing I've ever read about specifically the images in an author's home is in 2018, the Paris Review did a very brief, maybe like 1,000-word piece on the art in Diane Williams' home. But you gift us such more in-depth, I feel like, I'm sure we didn't see every piece in your home, but it was such a joy to get to walk through it. I'm thinking very specifically, there's an author in the crowd, Lucy Corin, whose art collection is just astounding. She also has a very, very, very good visual eye. So yeah, the home section, how did you pick which pieces to put in? You often say that you often would exchange writing for art.
Yeah.
So we know that you have more art than we're seeing.
This was one of the things that I figured out early on, was that, so again, it begins with my childhood home. It was full of my dad's pictures, some of them with like fresh paint on them, and some of them not finished. They were being looked at for a while, and then they go back into the studio and be worked on more. But also he would trade artworks, because we were as, the simple word for it is we were hippies and we were poor. So we were culturally rich and surrounded by interesting people. But, if you didn't want to just have calendars or posters on your wall, the thing to do was trade your artwork for other artwork. And this was what my dad did. And he had all kinds of amazing things. And there were specific pieces that went into the children's room, where I slept. And they were like, I thought of them at the time as like having been chosen to be right for children, but they were weird. They were pictures of people eating animals. And,
Amazing.
There was a very strange painting of a man's hat, sort of looked like a very formal, almost Depression era, like palette. The Ashcan school is what it always reminded me of a man's hat viewed from above, as if the hat was hanging on the wall like a fedora. But the artist had done another image in a layer of transparent gesso over the hat. So when you looked at it from an angle and the light caught the texture of the brushstrokes, there was a face on the hat. Well, that's sort of creepy. But I was like, these are the kids' paintings. And but the real point was that they were all so particular, whether they were my father's or his friends, or in some cases, there were things that were on our walls that were not, that couldn't be in a gallery. Like my father had decorated the kitchen nook by just driving all these flathead nails in the wall and then painting their heads with different rainbow colors. And it was just a way of making the house interesting. Or we had a house guest for a little while in the third floor. We had a kind of semi-communal, I grew up in a kind of semi-communal home. And so one of his former students, this guy, Hugh Hollinshead, came and stayed upstairs for a while. And he was one of those people that was like hard to get him out of the room sometimes. But then when he finally exited, he'd drawn in pencil all over that room's walls, which I think almost annoyed my parents, but it was another thing that I was responsive to. And so this idea that you don't have like a flat reproduction of Monet's water lilies, and you don't have like a Farrah Fawcett poster on your wall. You have objects that someone made that have more density and more particularity. And that when I first had homes of my own, even when I was a bookseller living in very, cheap apartments, crumbling apartments in the flats in Berkeley. I couldn't imagine not having artwork. I didn't want bare walls. So I needed to, find things or make things or convince people to give me things.
I love you describe when you went to college, one of the few things you took into your dorm room was like a huge one of your father's like huge paintings that you hung in your dorm room. It was just like, oh, well, I'll need something to put on my wall.
It was incredible that it survived that. I mean, but so then when I started writing these pieces, the first thought was, well, I don't want to talk about this as a transaction. Let's take money out of it and give me just a tiny artwork, a drawing or study or a sketch or a print or anything that you think is equivalent. And of course, I was the winner in that deal. I mean, that's obviously also very canny if you want to look at it as a calculation. I ended up with some really great things. But also there are pieces in the book, objects that I reproduce in that home section that are in a way only artworks because I framed them and hung them on my wall. There are
Yes.
also the making of something into an artwork by declaration. You know, there are things, objects made as jokes or gestures or collages made by a writer friend that doesn't regard themselves as a visual artist, but I was like,
Yes.
it kind of enshrined the thing. And I like having, I don't know, a spectrum of objects all the way up to, you know, the, oh my God, it's amazing that I actually own, you know, as I do now, you know, a photograph by Nan Golden, which is an incredible thing to own. But everything in between, down to like that collage that, you know, my friend once made and is still embarrassed that I put a frame around it. You know, that there's a way of taking, I don't know, making the relation something outside of the value index a little bit.
Something about the reproductions, the photographs, and the home section of the works that you live with that I found really an emotional reaction I was having that I found interesting was that with the sculptures, you get a sense of the lived life behind them because they cannot be, because they're not on white backdrops and they can't be confined to a square. Whereas with the paintings, you only gift us just the two-dimensional works. We just get a reproduction of the work itself. And what was the artistic design decision behind that? And I guess I will add one other thing to this question, which is you shared right before we began that you're curating a show mostly of these homeworks, which is so exciting. So how will they be presented that way? Will the home kind of come into that show at all, or will it be a white cube?
Yeah. Well, so, right. So I'll add to this description. In February in Claremont, where Pomona College is, which is where I teach, there's a museum in Claremont called the Benton. It was pretty nice, you know, mid-sized art museum. And they've incredibly allowed me to curate or co-curate with one of their real curators, a show based on this book, which is like not on one-to-one. It's not every image from the book. And there are artworks that I am interested in their collection, which are going into the show too. So it sort of has a oblique you know, overlap, you know, like a 70% overlap with the book. And yeah, a lot of them are coming off my own walls, but then
That's so fun.
There are artworks that are being loaned by artists, and in a couple of cases by collectors who have something. And and as I said, there are things that are in the Benton's permanent collection that intersect with the book in a really great way. But yes, well, so those pictures of the sculptures have to do with a very specific moment, and the essay about Charles Long. So I moved into a house in Claremont 6 years ago, what, you know, turned out to be a kind of the pre-quarantine, and I was setting up a new house really quickly. And at the same moment, my friend Charles Long lost a storage space for a lot of his old sculptures. And so I was like going to, you know, Home Depot and buying a carpet and a lamp. And Charles was like, maybe you should have some sculptures. And suddenly I lived in this house that was almost like a kind of holding area. Like we ferreted them into every space and they were on top of the refrigerator.
They looked like an invasive species.
It was really
amazing.
And what was so cool was that my kids were pretty young. And so I was actually creating something like my experience for them, which is that it was just a home space for them. But it was so full of these objects of that were not functional objects, but were everywhere and on all the shelves, and that they had to sometimes walk around. And Charles had built some also sculptural lamps. So a lot of the, even the functional objects, the lights they turned on were also sculptures. And I wanted to write about that experience. So I had to take pictures of them in situ and really show how much they were squirreled into that space. But most of what I have gathered over the years is wall art. That's actually really exceptional. That I is really a very particular thing that happened with Charles's sculptures.
Oh, those pieces are incredible. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm a little bit repeating myself or recircling back around with this question, but I could not emphasize emphasize enough the uniqueness of this book project. I mean, it's really unusual that you encounter a book when you think, I've never read a book that is trying to take this lens before. I mean, my list is so short, and I'm curious if it's because maybe I'm really poorly read in it. I mean, my list is really like Danielle Dutton has this book called A Picture Held as Captive, which is about her relationship writing about art, but it's very thin and doesn't have that personal breadth that yours has. The 2018 Diane Williams piece. And as far as writers living with and interpreting images, is there other literature in that vein that I'm missing?
Well, I mean, one thing that I thought about when this is going to seem really odd, but I thought of this book a little bit like an essay film, like Agnes Varda's The Gleaners and I.
I love that film. Wow.
Where the organizing principle is just a kind of a narrational quest that's being undertaken to share something, but it's not something that can be shared by a direct argument. It has to be a series of, well, now we need to look over here, like kind of discovery of and a kind of a cumulative discovery of examples that are building this sort of this world for you to enter and where you can climb into it. But I do have, some written points of reference. One thing is that the way Jeff Dyer writes about photography became, that was art writing that became meaningful to me. And I also thought a lot about, because this book is a combination of old pieces threaded along a new series of introductions or contextual things. I thought about books that were constructed that way, like Norman Mailer's Advertisements for Myself, where half of the book is, well, I wrote this, and who was I when I wrote this, and why is it here, and why am I putting it next to this other thing? So the book itself is like a kind of a gallery exhibition. I mean, it translates into this, or a box set, where you have like a series of odd objects that have to be threaded together through time.
I have one more question for Jonathan, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So if you have something stewing, get your question ready. Okay, I want to loop Cellophane Bricks. It's obviously, I think, very much of a project with all of your work, but also with Brooklyn Crime Novel, recently out in paperback, for many reasons. But its interest in the city as an emotional landscape. And it really made me think about how I think both of these books, I have always thought your work is so deeply in conversation with Renee Gladman, specifically her Revicka series.
That's wonderful. I'm so happy at that comparison.
That's my number one.
Yeah.
Like, I really do think your guys' work and practice is so in conversation with each other. The emotional feeling of the city, the city as language.
Well, I would also point to some common denominators there, like
yes,
Calvino's Invisible Cities.
Yes,
but also George Perec and the way he writes about Paris and the mystery of it. And for me, a book that I'm thinking about a lot right now is Cortázar's Hopscotch, and his ideas about Paris as this sort of, kind of impossible object, like behind these different doors, there are these different realities, and but that the character's emotional conjugation of, who are we to each other is being enacted on these streets and along the river and, in this music hall. And it's always about the emotional architecture of Paris.
I can totally see that. Do we have any questions from the audience? I think, Peter, will you come around with a
There's
mic?
a microphone coming to you. Oh, good. And then
good.
Oh, great.
Hi. So I have a couple of pieces of art that I've kept with me through like 15 apartments in 20 years, and I just can't imagine living without them in my house, even after all these years. Is there one or a couple of pieces of art that you've had the longest in your home and that has bounced with you from place to place to place that, you know, you couldn't see yourself being without?
That's great. Great question. Well, so I mean, one thing, I know I keep talking about my dad, but one thing is that one picture that's in the book, and I actually don't write about it descriptively. It's just in the book, called Kansas City Star, is a painting of it's of an architectural detail. It's of an industrial fan turbine object on top of the house that my parents lived in on the campus of the Kansas City Art Institute. And so I was born in 1964, and oh yeah, there it is, Kansas City Star. And so it's the house I first remember. It's the house in which that memory of trying to crawl into a studio happened. And then when we moved to Brooklyn in 67, the painting came with us. He painted it, I think, at 65 when I was, a year old, if a year old. And it hung in my parents' bedroom. Well, that's a very, Freudian scene, right? But I always felt that it was a kind of a vision of, its name and its weird kind of gravitational force. It's so simple, and so the colors are so rich, and it's large, and it was directly opposite their bed. And I would just be on my parents' bed when I was at 3, 4, 5-year-old, and then onward from there, looking at it. And it had a very finished kind of complete quality, whereas the paintings he was making later on were more conflictual and crazy, and often seemed more unfinished. It was very implacable. And I've looked at that picture my whole life. And it lives in my house. Actually, at the moment, I have it in my academic office. And it's about to move to the Benton and not be in a home for the first time, I guess, since it was painted in 65. Because it's not one that he ever, I guess maybe he had it in a gallery show at some point. I've never thought about that. I don't remember it ever anywhere except in their bedroom and then in my house. But then also, I when I was still a bookseller, but I sold my first novel, Gun with Occasional Music, it was published in 1994. I was working at Moe's, and then quite crazily and unexpectedly, it sold to the movies for a price which is not really that large, but was like 5 times what my publisher had paid me in the advance, because it was a very modest advance. And I knew I couldn't afford not to be a bookseller yet. So I sort of had this like weird check, and I thought the only way to feel really express how this makes me feel is to share it. And I had a painter friend named Mark Johnson, and he'd had a show, and I bought a painting. So I was 30 years old. I was sort of becoming a professional writer, but I was also still just a bookstore clerk. And most of my friends were in the same kind of mixed state. And Mark certainly was not a famous painter, but he had this painting I loved, and I bought it at like the gallery price because I had this check. And that painting lived with me in my bedroom in Berkeley from like 30 till I moved back to Brooklyn in 6 or 7 years later. And it lived with me in Brooklyn, and I've moved it from California to New York, and now it lives in Los Angeles with me. And it's a picture that my children have taken for granted, that they've never not seen. And it's weird. It's not, I'm very interested in that, taking for granted the strangeness of art. And this picture is, for them, this is another thing that interests me also, is like references that are back formations, because Mark's painting that I bought is a strong direct quotation of a Rembrandt, but Mark has inserted himself on a cell phone in the Rembrandt. And it's like the way that when I was a kid, I first knew about the hard-boiled voice, not because I read Raymond Chandler or even saw Humphrey Bogart, you know, in the Big in the Big Sleep or the Maltese Falcon, but because I heard Bugs Bunny pretending to be Humphrey Bogart, and then I had to work backwards to these sources, you know, that meant but it already meant a lot to me, even in this Bugs Bunny form. So for my kids, that Rembrandt painting, one day they're going to see it and be like, oh, that weird thing hanging in our house was a fake of this. You know, it'll be a back formation for them. There's a lot of, one thing you notice when you put all your writings about art and all your pictures in one place is, oh, I really like appropriation. You know, there's so much collage and quotation and appropriation in the artwork I like, which in other ways, other respects is very visually very diverse, but it seems that that method comes up over and over again.
Just wondering biographically how you ended up going from New York and ending up at Moe's.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, so the only thing, I mean, and actually it's a question that feeds back into one of the ideas in this book that we didn't get to. But when I abandoned art making for book writing, one of the things that I felt I lost was the individual object, you know, that aura that attaches, right, to making a drawing or a painting or a sculpture, because books are mass produced. But at the same time, I already had a kind of opposite feeling, which was I was already a book collector as a teenager. I loved individual objects and cherishing weird old books with eccentric specificity, like inscribed to a particular person or with a very unusual book plate, or even damaged in some way or changed in some way that made them interesting to me. The first bookseller I ever worked for was my very close friend Michael Seidenberg. When I walked into his bookshop when I was 14, and he was in his 20s, and he was starting out as a used bookseller. And we had a running joke, which is we would find a book that was just something was wrong with it, and he would always price them with the bookseller's term scarce thus. But I really like scarce thus, you know, like the way books, if they stick around, can become almost like artworks. They get some of the gravity and aura of an individual object. And as a book collector, I think about that, and I felt maybe it's a compensatory feeling that, you know, it also went together with caring a lot about what the artwork on the books was for me. So I was already a bookseller by trade when I was in high school, before I'd given up painting and switched to writing. And when I dropped out of college, it was the only thing I knew how to do for a living. I moved to Berkeley, and I began not at Moe's right away, although I walked in and gave Moe my hand typed up resume with the names of all the 6 or 7 bookstores I'd worked at in Brooklyn as a teenager, and tried to get a job at Moe's. But Moe's was the big time, and I had to do what in Berkeley was like the farm system. I had to work for Pegasus first, and then I could work my way up to Moe's. So I spent about 5 years working for the Pegasus, which is a couple of different stores. I worked at the one in Rockridge and the one in Albany, and then I, with a couple of my buddies, we kind of jumped to the big leagues all together and worked at Moe's for a while. My friend Will and my friend Bruno. But it's, you know, it was at a certain point, I would go around saying, I've only had 2 jobs, an author and a bookseller. Now I have this other professing job. I'm a professor, which seems a little less like a thing to boast about.
Do we have anything online? No. Okay. Oh, I've got one back.
Hi, you mentioned collage, but I'm wondering, besides the artwork that you've acquired through personal connection, what kinds of things do you look for in terms of style or medium or themes when you're approaching art and thinking about collecting it? What calls to you?
Well, I would emphasize that I really am a collector only. I mean, I don't identify with that word so directly, even though I've been collecting things all my life, books and stamps and coins and seashells and, you know, but with art, it's more like it really has emerged out of a kind of a social practice where it's like involvement with the artist has led to what I have in my house. Rather than me thinking like, what kind of collection am I putting together? It's more like what happened. And the house is a record of who I spent time with and who asked me to write about their work. You know, one thing that was actually confusing to me sort of halfway through this journey that leads to this book, where once I began to do this, it prospered, right? Artists would find me and I was, I suddenly had a number of really great photographs, and I didn't make photographs, and my father wasn't a photographer, but I had written about Gregory Crewdson and had a picture, and I had written about Larry Sultan, and I had a Larry Sultan in my house, and more recently, I was in this amazing experience with Nan Golden. It was actually her videos, her I wrote for a catalog that accompanied a presentation, a museum presentation of all her video work. And that's what I wrote about. But she gave me a picture. And I sort of thought, well, how did this happen? How did I become like a photography guy? That's cool, but it wasn't what I thought I was most related to or identified with. But then again, my own writing is totally immersed in cinema. And so in another sense, these still pictures, you know, Gregory Crewdson's work is strongly out of Hitchcock and David Lynch, and you know, Nan Golden makes videos as well as photographs, and her photographs are often of the same people in many different situations. So they have a quality of being like a kind of implicit filmic evidence that she's making. So I thought, oh, this is why this attracts me and why I've involved myself with it, with modern photography without even noticing, is because it comes up through my excitement about cinema.
So maybe time for one more. Any takers? Well, we find ourselves at the top of the hour. Jonathan Lethem, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
We
Thank
love
you.
you too.
It's great.
And thanks to all of you. And of course, those of you online as well, we will be holding a signing. The way we're going to work is trying to get you all on that side of the room. Pay for the book first, bring it over, and then I'm going to come to you with a little Post-it. And if you would like write to whom you would like it inscribed.
The Post-it
that would
is
be
great. It
Yeah.
really relaxes me so much that I can hang out and talk with you.
So thank you all again.